The scent of barbecue smoke drifted lazily across the neatly mowed lawn of the Thompson home. It was a bright, golden Saturday in late August, the kind Ohio offered up like a gift just before the weather turned bitter and gray. Helen Thompson, 58, moved briskly between the grill and the long, folding table draped in checkered cloth, arranging bowls of potato salad and baked beans, her hands steady though her mind was elsewhere. Every year, the family gathered in their backyard for the annual end-of-summer barbecue. It had become a tradition after her mother passed. Helen and Rick had hosted it for the last 12 years, ever since they'd built the big patio and installed the smoker Rick insisted on buying. Family should eat together, Helen always said, even if we have to drag them out with ribs. Today, the chairs were all set out in a half-moon facing the grill. Red plastic cups and pitchers of iced tea glistened under the sunlight. Everything looked perfect. Except Helen's heart was racing. Rick, her husband of 35 years, stood across the lawn laughing too hard at something Amber had said. Amber, 29, was her niece, her younger sister Lisa's daughter, the one Helen had practically raised, who stayed with them during college breaks, who called Helen Auntie H with a sweet innocence that now somehow felt like a performance. Helen watched them from behind the grill lid. Rick tossed his head back in amusement, the same way he used to when she made him laugh. Amber leaned in, a little too close. Her hand lingered on Rick's arm as she whispered something, and Helen caught a flicker in his eyes. Hesitation? Guilt? She blinked it away and flipped the ribs. 2 weeks ago, she would have told herself she was imagining things, that maybe Rick was just going through one of his phases, retirement looming, the quiet of an empty nest stretching out like a yawning hallway. But that was before the receipt, before the strange texts, before the moments that didn't add up. Helen had built her life around Rick. They had met in college. He was charming and stubborn. She was practical and soft-spoken. Over the years, they'd weathered storms, job losses, miscarriages, money troubles. They'd made it through, or so she thought. Amber had always been bright, bold, maybe a little wild. She went through phases, punk music, bohemian skirts, yoga retreats. But Helen had seen the hurt behind it all. Amber's father left when she was 8. Lisa raised her alone. Rick had stepped in, doting like a father figure. Helen had trusted them both, until now. Aunt Carol was the first to arrive, followed by Lisa and her new husband. The backyard began to fill with voices and laughter, the sound of coolers popping open and kids running through sprinklers. Helen greeted everyone with hugs and practiced smiles, handing out plates like armor. Rick barely glanced her way. When Amber finally arrived, 20 minutes late, Helen noticed 3 things. 1. Amber was wearing the gold necklace Rick gave Helen for their anniversary last year. 2. She was wearing Rick's favorite cologne, his cologne. 3. She looked Helen straight in the eyes and smiled like nothing was wrong in the world. "Hey, Auntie H," Amber sang, kissing her cheek. "Smells amazing, as always." "Thank you," Helen replied evenly. Her hands didn't shake. "I hope you're hungry." "Oh, I'm starving," Amber said, flashing teeth. "I could just eat everything today." Rick appeared behind her, carrying a tray of drinks. His eyes flicked toward Helen and then away. "Need any help, hun?" She shook her head. "Number, everything's under control." She watched them as they walked away, heads close, whispering. And in that moment, Helen felt something click inside her, something heavy and sharp. It was no longer a question of if, only how. She flipped another rib, the sizzle masking the sound of her breath catching. This wasn't just a barbecue anymore. It was the prelude to something none of them would forget. 2 weeks before the barbecue, Helen had been folding laundry in the quiet hum of the downstairs den. She'd always found a strange comfort in that chore, matching socks, smoothing wrinkles, separating whites. 35 years of habit made the motions automatic, but that day her fingers froze when they brushed something inside Rick's khaki slacks. A receipt. It was tucked deep in the pocket, curled and slightly torn. Helen unfolded it gently. The ink was still crisp. June 23rd. Paradise Boutique. Lingerie set. $128.49. The size printed at the bottom made her stomach churn. S. She hadn't worn a small in over a decade. At first, she just stared at it, Her mind tried to protect her, to rationalize. Maybe it was a gift for a friend's wife, a gag gift for a retirement party. But Rick didn't have that kind of sense of humor, and he never bought gifts without asking her opinion. Helen folded the receipt and placed it in her cardigan pocket, her pulse quickening, but her face calm. Later that night, as they watched TV together, Rick reached over and rubbed her shoulder absent-mindedly. She looked at him, studied the familiar lines of his face, the silver dusting his temples, and felt utterly foreign beside him. The next morning brought the second clue. Rick's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter while he was in the shower. Helen never snooped, never had to, but something made her glance over. The message preview read, "Last night was worth the risk. Can't wait for Sunday." There was no name, just a heart emoji. Helen didn't open it. She didn't need to. The words burrowed into her chest like glass. When Rick came downstairs moments later, freshly shaved and humming, she handed him his coffee like nothing had happened. He sipped it, smiled, and kissed her on the temple. That night, Helen lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan, spinning shadows across the room. Her mind cataloged every moment over the past year that hadn't felt quite right. The sudden change in his cologne, his insistence on keeping his phone face down, the way he'd begun staying late at poker nights when she knew the group hadn't met in months. But it wasn't until Amber dropped by unexpectedly that everything began to connect. Amber had shown up with a bottle of wine and a too cheery smile. "I was in the neighborhood," she said, placing the bottle on the counter. Helen hadn't seen her in over a month. She remembered thinking Amber looked different that day, radiant in a way that didn't come from skincare or sleep. She had that unmistakable glow, the kind of satisfaction that came from feeling chosen. They'd sipped wine and chatted about nothing. Amber mentioned she was seeing someone, but wouldn't say who. "It's complicated," she giggled, eyes darting around. Helen had smiled politely, her stomach clenching. Rick came home half an hour later and froze when he saw Amber sitting at the kitchen island. Just for a second, but enough for Helen to notice. His voice was too loud when he greeted her, his laugh just a beat too long. Amber got up to hug him, a lingering embrace. When Helen did the dishes that night, she noticed 2 glasses with smudged lipstick. She had only used one. The pieces fell together like slow, sick clockwork. Helen didn't scream. She didn't accuse. Not yet. That wasn't her style. Instead, she wrote in her garden journal that night, something she rarely did anymore. She logged her suspicions like weather patterns, each detail a cloud in the sky. She was hurt, yes, but more than anything, she was watching. The next day, she told Rick she'd be working longer hours at the shelter. She kissed him on the cheek and smiled. Then she drove past the shelter and parked down the street, waiting. 3 hours later, Amber pulled up to the house in her red convertible. Helen watched from a distance as Amber let herself inside with the keys she forgot to return last Christmas. And Rick, he was home. Car in the driveway, curtains drawn. Helen's fingers clenched the steering wheel so hard they turned white. Her voice quiet but certain in her mind. "You've both made your choices. Now I'll make mine." Amber had always been the golden girl of the family. With her honey blonde hair, infectious laugh, and a natural talent for charming a room, she was the kind of woman people noticed, even when she wasn't trying. Helen used to be proud of that. She remembered the way Amber clung to her legs as a child, the way she'd begged to sleep over, calling Helen's lasagna magic food. After Amber's father walked out, Helen stepped in, not out of obligation, but love. When Amber turned 16, it was Helen who took her shopping for her first car. It was Helen who paid for her first semester when Lisa couldn't cover the tuition, and it was Rick who taught her how to drive, who laughed at her jokes even when they weren't funny, who always gave her the best seat at the table. Back then, it was sweet, harmless. Now it felt like betrayal in slow motion. The week before the barbecue, Helen decided to come home early from her volunteer shift at the animal shelter. She didn't announce it. She just left quietly, her heart pounding with something that felt like dread wrapped in curiosity. When she pulled into the driveway, Rick's car was already there. Amber's convertible was too. Helen's breath hitched, but she moved carefully, quietly. She didn't slam the car door. She crept up the side of the house and peeked through the kitchen window. There they were, Amber and Rick, standing by the fridge. Too close. Amber was laughing, and Rick had his hand on her back. It wasn't a friendly touch. It was possessive. And when Amber leaned into his chest and whispered something, Rick's hand slid down ever so slightly. Then suddenly he stepped back, as if catching himself. Helen stepped away from the window before either of them saw her. Her heart thudded in her ears. She didn't barge in. She didn't confront them. Instead, she sat in her car and waited. 15 minutes later, Amber walked out of the house with wet hair and the same shirt she wore last Christmas, the one Helen had gifted her in a box with a handwritten note. Now it looked like a costume on a stranger. Helen followed Amber's car from a distance, her thoughts racing but her face cold and still. Amber pulled into a coffee shop, probably assuming no one was watching. Inside, Helen watched through the glass as Amber pulled out her phone and smiled. Her thumb moved quickly, texting. When Helen returned home, Rick was in the garage, tinkering with something he'd long ago lost interest in. He looked up and smiled as she walked in, wiping his hands with a rag. "You're home early." "Yeah," Helen said, placing her purse on the counter. "I had a headache." He walked over and kissed her on the cheek, too quick. "Want me to make you some tea?" "Number, I think I'll lie down." That night, as Helen changed into her pajamas, she noticed something strange. A faint scent on Rick's pillow. Familiar but out of place. It was her perfume, not Helen's. Amber's. A sugary blend she used to find charming. Now it made her nauseous. The next day, Amber texted her, "Can I stop by tomorrow?" "Just to catch up, Auntie. I miss you." Helen replied, "Of course. I'll be home." When Amber arrived, Helen greeted her with a warm hug, holding her just a moment longer than usual. They sat in the living room. Helen made tea, listened to Amber's ramblings about a new project at work, a new guy she was seeing. "He's older," Amber said with a smirk, looking down at her cup. "Married. Complicated." Helen didn't flinch. "Oh," she said, pouring more tea. "Sounds messy." Amber giggled. "You could say that." She never said Rick's name. She didn't have to. After Amber left, Helen sat on the porch, rocking slowly in the swing she and Rick had built years ago. The summer wind whispered through the trees and everything looked normal. Quiet. Peaceful. But Helen knew peace was an illusion now. Whatever they thought they were hiding, they weren't. They were flaunting it, and she was done pretending not to see. Helen had never considered herself a suspicious woman. She believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt, until they gave her a reason not to. Now Rick and Amber had given her every reason. But Helen wasn't about to scream or throw dishes. She didn't confront, accuse, or cry. Instead, she planned, slowly, methodically, the way she tended her garden in spring. Quiet hands, sharp shears. The first step was Rick's office. It was technically his space, but Helen cleaned it weekly. She knew every drawer, every folder, every password. He hadn't changed them in years. So on a calm Wednesday afternoon, while Rick was running errands, she slipped inside, closed the door softly, and opened his laptop. The messages were there. He hadn't deleted them. Emails first, a chain of communication from a hidden Gmail account, full of poorly disguised affection. "I miss our secret mornings. Can't wait to taste you again. Don't worry, she'll never suspect." Helen's stomach lurched, but she kept reading. There were attachments. Selfies Amber had taken in hotel mirrors, some in lacy red lingerie, others just of her legs on a hotel bed with Rick's watch on her ankle. Helen recognized the robe in the background. It was the deep red one she bought Rick for their anniversary, the same year Amber borrowed it after a pool party and never returned it. She downloaded everything, copied it onto a USB and hid it inside the lining of her purse. Step 2. The recording. Helen went to the electronics store the next day and bought a tiny voice-activated recorder. Meant for students, the box said. She tucked it into a floral vase in the hallway, where Amber and Rick often stood talking when they thought she wasn't paying attention. She didn't have to wait long. On Friday afternoon, she stepped out for groceries, but left the recorder running. When she returned, the house was empty. Rick had texted, "Went out for a bit." Amber dropped by. "All good?" Helen plugged in the recorder that night with trembling fingers. What she heard made her press her palm over her mouth. Amber's voice, soft but confident. She suspects something. I can tell. Rick. She always overthinks. Don't worry. Just act normal at the barbecue. Amber. You promise you'll talk to her? About us? Rick. After the summer. I just need a little more time. Let's not ruin things just yet. Helen sat in silence for a long time. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the ease in their voices, the comfort, the way they plotted her. Emotional execution like it was a delayed to-do list. She stared at her reflection in the darkened window that night, unable to recognize the woman looking back. But instead of crying, she made a decision. She would not fall apart. She would not scream or throw plates or beg for explanations. She would let them walk right into their own undoing, and she would make sure it happened with every single person in the family watching. That weekend, she began to plan the barbecue like it was just another family gathering. She ordered extra chairs, made her famous deviled eggs, even called her cousin Mary, who hadn't come in years, and convinced her to bring her new boyfriend. The more eyes, the better. She printed the emails, the texts, the photos. She placed them in a simple manila folder, tucked beneath a decorative napkin holder in a basket near the patio. She had one more detail to arrange, one final message to tie it all together. Late at night, with shaking hands, she wrote out her toast on the back of an old recipe card. And when she looked down at her final line, to those who confuse love with possession, this one's for you, she didn't feel pain. She felt power, the kind that comes not from vengeance but from clarity. The day of the barbecue dawned warm and clear, a soft golden light painting the lawn and making the leaves shimmer like nothing in the world could possibly go wrong. Helen stood at the kitchen sink, squeezing fresh lemons into a glass pitcher of sweet tea, the scent bright and sharp. Her hands moved with mechanical grace. This slice, that stir. The woman in the reflection of the kitchen window looked calm, elegant even. But inside, Helen was made of steel threads wound tight. She had dressed carefully that morning. Soft cornflower blue blouse, white linen slacks, a gold chain Rick had given her decades ago, back when gifts had meant something. Her silver hair framed her face in gentle waves. Her lipstick, a dusty rose, didn't tremble once as she applied it. She was hosting this gathering not as a woman on the edge of heartbreak, but as a woman who knew exactly what needed to be done. By noon, the backyard buzzed with laughter and voices. The picnic tables were full, the smoker hissed with brisket and ribs, and the kids were already soaked from running through the sprinkler. Rick moved through the yard like a king in his element, smiling, joking, flipping burgers on the grill. He waved at neighbors, handed cold drinks to his cousins, slipped his arm around Helen's waist when no one was looking, and Helen let him. Everything looks amazing, he said, his voice low against her temple. Doesn't it? She replied, smiling. I wanted this one to be memorable. He chuckled. You always do it right, Helen. She looked at him and held the moment just long enough. Yes, I do. Amber arrived fashionably late, like always. Her sundress clung too tightly for a family event. Her hair, perfectly tousled like she hadn't tried at all. She brought a fruit tart and air-kissed Helen's cheek. You look gorgeous, Auntie H. Helen smiled. So do you, sweetheart. That's a lovely dress. Amber grinned, smug. Rick said it's his favorite color on me. Helen's eyes didn't flicker. Is that so? The two women stood there for a beat too long, one with polished grace, the other with quiet arrogance. But it was Amber who finally stepped away, floating across the yard with her drink, slipping easily into the crowd like nothing in the world could touch her. Helen's niece, her husband's mistress. Helen passed out the plates, refilled drinks, laughed in all the right places. She posed for a photo with Lisa, held a baby for her second cousin, and complimented her brother's new haircut. It was like she was performing a role written for her. Wife, hostess, matriarch. But in the center of the dining table sat a small wicker basket. Tucked inside, just beneath a stack of red napkins, was a manila folder. And when the sun began to dip behind the trees and fireflies started blinking through the hedge, Helen stood up and gently tapped her glass. Can I have everyone's attention, please? Rick glanced at her, smiling. He had a napkin tucked into the collar of his shirt and a beer in his hand. Ah, the famous Helen toast. Everyone laughed. Amber turned her chair slightly toward Helen and crossed her legs. I won't keep you long, Helen began, her voice smooth, her posture straight. This tradition started after my mother passed. Every summer, we gathered to celebrate family. Our roots, our loyalty, our love. Heads nodded. Someone murmured, Here, here. Helen continued. But today I want to toast not to what we think family means, but what we show each other it really is. A hush settled over the backyard. The air, once light and casual, tightened. She reached into the basket. I want to thank someone in particular this year. Someone who taught me that betrayal doesn't always come with warning signs. Sometimes it wears familiar faces, and sometimes it wears a sundress and calls you auntie. There was a pause, a sharp inhale somewhere in the group. Rick's smile faltered. Amber's glass froze midway to her lips. Helen held up the manila folder. And for anyone who doubts what I'm saying, don't worry. I brought proof. Texts, photos, emails. I made copies. Gasps rippled across the yard like cracks in ice. Helen looked straight at Rick. 35 years of marriage, Rick. And this is what you do? With her? Rick's mouth opened, but no words came. Then she turned to Amber. And you? You called me auntie. You slept under my roof. You cried on my shoulder when your father left. You let me believe I was family to you. Amber stood suddenly. This isn't... Helen raised a hand. Don't. Not here. Not now. You made your choices, and I've made mine. She placed the folder on the table in front of Lisa, Amber's mother, who sat stunned, pale. Lisa's hands trembled as she opened it. And with the sun dipping below the trees, Helen stepped back from the table, her voice unwavering. Consider this my last family barbecue. For a long moment, no one moved. The backyard, just minutes ago, filled with laughter, the scent of grilled meat and the clinking of glasses, was silent except for the hum of a passing cicada. Lisa stared down at the contents of the manila folder, her mouth slowly opening, then closing again. Amber's photographs, half lit in hotel mirrors, were the first to slide into view. Glossy, printed, undeniable. Her daughter, her niece. Rick took a cautious step toward Helen. His face had gone ashen, beer bottle forgotten in his hand. Helen, he said, voice low, we should talk about this, in private. Helen tilted her head slightly. Number, that's what you wanted. Privacy, secrecy, that's how this happened. Amber's face twisted from shock to anger. You went through my phone, my messages? That's, Helen cut her off sharply. Illegal? Immoral? Like having an affair with your aunt's husband? A few people gasped. Others turned their heads. Rick shifted, his hand brushing Amber's arm as if to steady her. That tiny gesture, his instinct to comfort Amber in that moment, was the final nail. Lisa stood slowly, gripping the edge of the table. Is this true? She asked, voice trembling. Her eyes darted between her daughter and her brother-in-law. Amber. Amber couldn't meet her mother's eyes. She opened her mouth, then shut it again. Helen watched Lisa's face contort. Pain, disbelief, fury, all crashing into each other. Rick finally found his voice. It was a mistake. It just happened. We didn't mean for it to go this far. Helen laughed then, a soft, bitter sound. Oh, it went far. You lied to me. You snuck around. You took something sacred and turned it into this. She turned toward the guests, her cousins, her neighbors, Rick's co-workers. I won't be the woman who pretends she didn't see what was in front of her. I won't keep pouring sweet tea and passing ribs while you two pass each other glances across the potato salad. Someone stifled a sob. Another guest grabbed their purse. Lisa stepped forward, her hand connected with Amber's cheek in a sharp, clean smack that echoed across the patio. Amber staggered back, clutching her face. Mom! You disgust me, Lisa whispered. Rick reached for Helen again. Please, let's just talk, please. Helen didn't flinch. She looked at him like she was studying a stranger. You could have left me. You could have divorced me, Rick. But you didn't. You wanted your reputation in your affair. You wanted to be the good man on the grill and the man slipping away with my niece when my back was turned. She picked up the envelope that once held the photos and pulled out one last piece of paper, an envelope of her own. She held it out to him. "What's this?" he asked. "Divorce papers," she said simply. "Already signed. You'll find your toothbrush on the porch. I recommend using the side gate. Don't step on my roses." Rick looked like he'd been slapped too. His face crumpled, his chest visibly rising and falling, like he couldn't catch his breath. "Helen, you're serious. I've never been clearer." Amber turned toward Helen, tears now spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't mean—" Helen raised a single hand. "Stop. Don't insult me or yourself by pretending this was an accident." The crowd slowly began to move. People standing, awkwardly murmuring goodbyes, grabbing purses and coats, sneaking glances at the woman who had just burned down her life with elegance and dignity. Helen didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply stood there, surrounded by the wreckage of two people's choices, and let the wind lift her silver hair from her shoulders. Rick stood frozen, divorce papers in hand, as Lisa took Amber by the arm and dragged her toward the gate. No one stopped them. No one defended them. And Helen simply turned toward the smoker, still gently billowing smoke, and switched it off. As if the whole day had been a performance, and now the curtain had fallen. The guests were gone. The folding chairs sat empty, the tablecloths fluttering softly in the breeze. Paper cups and plastic forks littered the yard like remnants of a war no one saw coming. A red balloon drifted lazily against the fence, forgotten. Helen stood at the kitchen sink, her hands still wet from rinsing the last dish. Though the faucet had been off for some time, she wasn't washing anymore, just staring at her own reflection in the darkened window. Her face was calm, quiet, but her eyes told the truth. Hollowed out, heavy. Rick was gone. She had watched him drive away 20 minutes earlier, his tail lights flashing once as he paused at the curb like he might turn back. But he didn't. Helen hadn't moved from the porch. She hadn't waved. She hadn't said goodbye. On the kitchen island, the signed divorce papers sat next to a glass of untouched iced tea. She didn't bother to put them away. There was no more pretending, no more preserving what had already rotted. The doorbell rang. Helen blinked, slowly wiping her hands on a towel. She opened the door to find Lisa standing there, alone. Lisa looked older than she had that morning. Hair frizzed, eyes swollen, makeup smudged like war paint. I didn't know," Lisa said. Helen stepped aside and nodded. "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table in silence for a long time. Two sisters, devastated by the same wound, but bleeding in different directions. "I don't know what to say," Lisa whispered. "I raised her to be better than this." Helen stared down at her hands. "You raised her fine. People still make their choices," Lisa sniffed. "She said it started months ago, that she didn't mean to fall in love, that Rick made her feel special," Helen said bitterly. "So did I. So did this family. That wasn't enough?" Lisa's shoulders collapsed. "She's ashamed, Helen, but she's also angry. She thinks you humiliated her." Helen gave a sharp, joyless laugh. "She humiliated herself. I just held up the mirror." Lisa nodded, then reached across the table. "I'm sorry, I really am. For what she did. For what he did. For not seeing it." Helen hesitated, then took her hand. "I know you are." The silence after that was soft, tired. Eventually, Lisa stood. "What are you going to do now?" Helen looked around the house, the pictures still on the walls, the photo albums tucked in the corner, the garden visible through the sliding doors. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I know what I won't do. I won't shrink. I won't hide. I won't let this make me smaller." Lisa nodded. "Good, because you were the only one who stood tall today." They hugged, an embrace layered with grief, rage, sisterhood, and exhaustion. Lisa left shortly after, walking down the driveway with her shoulders hunched and hands buried in her jacket pockets. Helen returned to the yard. She gathered the trash, folded the chairs, took down the string lights Rick had installed just last year. When she reached the rose bushes, the ones they'd planted together 20 years ago, She knelt down and pulled a single weed from the soil. The silence of her backyard wasn't empty. It was clean. Her phone buzzed later that night. A message from Amber. "You didn't have to do it like that." Helen stared at it for a long while before deleting it without responding. Then, just before bed, she pulled a fresh notebook from her drawer. One she'd been saving for a trip she never took. On the first page, she wrote, 35 years of marriage, one betrayal, zero regrets about standing up for myself. She closed the notebook and turned off the light. For the first time in a long time, Helen slept deeply, and she didn't dream of him. Autumn came early that year. The leaves turned faster than usual, brilliant reds and burnt oranges carpeting the streets of Helen's quiet Ohio neighborhood. There was a stillness in the air, but for Helen it wasn't emptiness, it was peace. Weeks had passed since the barbecue. The divorce was finalized. Rick never returned. Not for his tools, not for his books, not for closure. He sent a single email. Helen never replied. Amber moved out of state shortly after. No forwarding address, no apology. Helen didn't chase either of them. Instead, she chased the quiet things. Mornings with coffee on the porch, afternoons spent repainting the kitchen, evenings with a book open on her lap and no one lying beside her. And for the first time, that felt like freedom. She took a weekend trip to Hocking, hills, hiked alone, stood at the edge of the gorge and breathed in air untouched by betrayal. In town, a woman at a cafe complimented her silver hair. Helen smiled, not politely, but truly. One morning, she opened the shed and found Rick's old smoker still sitting in the corner. She stared at it for a long time before dragging it to the curb. By evening, it was gone. She didn't need it anymore. Helen planted new rose bushes in place of the old ones, white ones this time, clean, sharp, unspoiled. She dug with bare hands, dirt under her nails, sweat on her brow. It felt good, it felt earned. And when her neighbor passed by and said, "It's good to see you smiling again," Helen simply nodded. It's good to finally feel like I mean it, because she did.